Welcome to CEO Growth Talks with Chief Outsiders. Today we talk about sales readiness and how it's a critical part of sales performance. And I'm interested to hear what Aaron and Dan have to say with some of their initial findings in terms of what matters for sales readiness. So for our panel today, we have two very experienced sales executives. Welcome, Dan, and welcome, Aaron. Dan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Dan Lackner. As Angus mentioned, I'm a Chief Sales Officer here at Chief Outsiders. I've been with the company for about the last 6 months or so. And prior to that, I was involved as a leadership position, mostly for large software companies and data companies.
Aaron.
Hi, everybody. Aaron Gutowski, Chief Outsiders. I've been here about as long as Dan. We kicked off the inaugural class of our Chief Sales Officers. Prior to that, I was with a company called Global Data, where I headed up the financial markets sales effort. I've got over 20 years experience leading SaaS-oriented sales teams, and I'm really happy to be here and share some of our process and findings here.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing some of your insights about sales and what it takes to drive sales performance. And if there's any questions throughout, feel free to add them in the comments. But we'll start with the first question to you, Dan. When thinking about sales performance, you came up with this idea of a sales assessment. So where did this idea come from?
Yeah, great question. So as Angus mentioned, the Chief Sales Officer program at Chief Outsiders started about 6 months ago. And we gathered together for the very first time as a group back in February of this year. We were together for 3 days. At the end of the 3-day session, we had sort of an impromptu discussion about our various approaches for evaluating a sales organization. And, the six of us spent an hour or so going back and forth at the whiteboard, each of us talking about how we approach engagements and how we've done this in the past. At the end of the hour, we ended up distilling our approach down into 4 different areas. And it just so happens they all began with the letter P: people, process, platform, and performance. It's purely coincidental that it matches and lines up with marketing. Marketing has obviously the 5 Ps of price, product placement, portfolio, and people. But I think the parallel was rather handy, nevertheless.
Great. Thanks, Dan. And Aaron, can you tell me a little bit more about the assessment itself? When you think about those 4 Ps, what are some of the details that the assessment dives into? What does it measure?
Absolutely. So our approach is typically we're working with a CEO and their senior leadership, and we want to assess those 4 areas, the 4 Ps. So the first P, people, the question we'll answer around that is, do you have the right people and talent to support your market need? In terms of the process, what is the appropriate sales process, and can it be deployed to create a win rate in a repeatable manner? Thirdly, around the platform, do you have the modern sales technologies in place to support your sales team? And then lastly, in terms of performance, are you tracking all the right metrics, and does your financial model reflect a realistic and appropriate balance of revenue and investment? So diving into each of those a little bit more detail. Around the people, it's when you're evaluating the ability to achieve your goals, you want to consider not only the size of the team, you want to consider the individual skill sets, their strengths and weaknesses, their roles in the sales process, who else you bring in as a resource to help you close the deal, and what is the appropriate leadership structure in terms of how you who's leading the team. In terms of process, there's all kinds of different sales processes and methodologies that are out there. What we want to do is make sure we've tailored a sales process that's specific to your organization. So from when a lead first comes in the door, to your initial outreach, to ultimately closing the sale and the revenue recognition. And then all the handoffs along the way and the specific milestones that you would achieve throughout the sales process. In terms of the platform, we're going to assess your technology. Typically, we find it's either being misused or not used at all or underutilized. We want to make sure that we have the right tools in place and make sure they're deployed for maximum usage by the sales team. And then we create education programs and standardize procedures to make sure that the team is well educated on how to leverage the tools. And then lastly, in terms of performance, this is kind of an overarching theme. We want to consider not only the top line revenue, but what's the margin impact on the sales function. We look at sales metrics and those KPIs that are really key to successfully bringing in a deal. Forecasting, quotas, compensation, headcount, your customer acquisition costs. These are all performance measurements that we'll come in and take a look at. So that, to answer your question, Angus, those are the kinds of things we measure in a bit more detail.
Got it. Thank you for diving in there. And both of you have decades of experience as salespeople, leading sales teams in these 4 areas. I'm sure you've seen where companies or teams do this well, and other examples where things don't go quite as well. Based on your experience, Aaron, can you share an example of how this plays out in the real world relative to one of these 4 critical areas for sales readiness that drive sales performance?
Absolutely. I usually find some issues around the process, in particular, the amount of time it takes to complete a sales process. And that can affect forecasts. So there was one of my clients that had an issue around their forecasting. And when I dug underneath it, I found that the process that they set up was a good process. It's just the salespeople were not allowing enough time for each stage, particularly around the evaluation stage and doing that in a timely fashion. So we implemented some strategies to speed up that process, and ultimately we were able to get more accurate forecasting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Having that process defined and knowing the overall sales cycle, but then breaking it down to each of the stages, what activity goes into each stage, how long does each stage last, are you progressing or not to the next stage? A lot of companies struggle to get that in place in a way that's really clearly understood by the broader team. But once you do, you can get to a more predictable forecasting, as you said. So Dan, how about you? Any examples, any areas where you've seen this work or not work in particular?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time, at least initially in my engagements, looking at the platform. And as Aaron mentioned at the outset, platform looks at the technology platforms that are in use within the organization. We kind of do a deep dive looking at the proficiency of the users. And then secondly, at the reliability of the data. More often than not, again, Aaron mentioned this, we find that systems like the CRM system, it's either underutilized or not utilized appropriately. Mindset I go into these engagements with is, if it's not in the CRM, it didn't happen. So I'm a strong advocate for using the CRM as being ground truth in organizations. Oftentimes, I find that really haven't been configured for the business. Potentially they are configured by an IT person who really didn't have a solid understanding of the business or didn't work closely with the business sponsors to implement them appropriately. Secondly, you often find that the business has evolved over time and the system has not kept up, or it has vestiges of old products and old ways of doing things, and it just becomes cluttered. And clutter, what that does is that gets in the way of users using the system and using it productively, because they have to sort through all this stuff and all these fields that are no longer used anymore. I'd say one of the biggest issues I find is something I call the leaky pipeline, that leads are coming into the organization from all sorts of different places, but they're not being funneled into a one universal pipeline for follow-up. And there's no SLAs in place. And everybody knows that the person who responds the fastest to an inbound lead is the person who's likely to get it. But when you have these leaky pipelines where leads come in, they're not followed up on, it just shows you're not in tune with the customer. And then finally, and again, Aaron mentioned this is forecasting. And this gets back to the reliability of the data. I've done several of these assessments over the last couple of weeks, and invariably, forecasting becomes one of the biggest issues, where people either don't understand what the forecast is, or the forecast is not timely, or their forecast is just not correct. And so fixing that is obviously a top priority. Now, the good news is, and I just went through a number of different issues, many of these problems can be, once diagnosed, they can be fixed really quickly. These systems are easy to configure and changing it back on track. Fixing forecasting, that takes a bit more time. Aaron mentioned you have to fix the processes, but boy, the payoff on good forecasting can't be understated. Predictability of your business just makes it worth the effort, because that's the way you're going to drive additional resources and investment in your business if you can show a predictable revenue stream.
Got it. When it comes to marketing and sales alignment, I see that quite a lot too. The handoff between marketing and sales, it's just a mess. And it just creates all this tension, all this friction, all this finger pointing, marketing saying, hey, I generated these leads. What are you doing with them? And sales is saying, you're not giving me any good leads. Dan, do you have any approaches there to try to connect those two worlds? Because the hard part's been done. The demand has been generated. You've got this opportunity to create pipeline, but as you said, you've got that leak happening. So operationally, that can have an impact straight to revenue if that's addressed. What are some tactics you use to help close that gap or that leaky bucket?
Yeah, well, the biggest thing, obviously, number one, is making sure your systems are instrumented correctly. So I've worked on engagements where leads are coming in, lots of leads. They're coming in from social media more and more. They're coming in from forums or coming in from trade shows and events. And the important thing here is that marketing and sales have to have a tight interlock. And the way you get a tight interlock and collaboration between marketing and sales is you've got to have a weekly meeting. This is one of the things I look for in every organization, where you sit down, the marketing person lays out all the leads that came in over the course of the week. And then the salesperson talks about the disposition of those leads. How long did it take to follow up on the leads? Did these leads matriculate and turn into opportunities? What is the quality of the leads? Do we need to do some things at the top of the funnel to strip out leads that might not be qualified? Are we applying the correct criteria at the MQL level to making sure that these marketing qualified leads are truly leads? The worst thing that you can do is start to give salespeople bad leads, because immediately then their impression is that all leads that marketing are delivering are no good. And so tightening down on those criteria at the marketing level before you deliver the leads to the sales team is critically important.
Thanks, Dan. And as you alluded to earlier, you and Aaron and the fractional sales team here at Chief Outsiders has put together this assessment that looks at sales readiness across these 4 areas of people, process, platform, and performance. And understanding that sales readiness drives directly to sales performance. And you highlighted that you and Aaron have started to run through some of these sales assessments and starting to get some initial findings. So what are you seeing?
Yeah, Angus, actually I have a slide there if you want to throw the slide up for everybody. So this is just one of the deliverables that comes out of a sales assessment. And naturally, you see here on the left-hand side, we've ranked this company in terms of sales readiness vis-a-vis other companies that have completed a sales readiness assessment. And on the right-hand side, we show the gaps in this radar chart along each of the different 4 P's and dimensions. If you're like anybody, you naturally are going to start focusing on the aggregate scores, and you're going to say, boy, I'm going to focus on the area with the biggest gaps. And so maybe I'm going to focus on, in this case, maybe I'll focus on the performance gap or the platform gap. But that's not where the news is. So you've got to get beyond sort of the aggregates and the averages, because they hide the real telling stories. What I like to do is, first of all, is I like to make sure that multiple people in the organization complete the sales readiness assessment. And then what I do is I go through and I compare responses between and among the different leaders. I compare the CEO to the CSO. I compare the CMO to the CSO to see where the gaps are. Sure, the aggregate scores tell a story, but the more telling stories are at the detail. Interestingly enough, and I've done 3 or 4 of these so far, I went into this with the impression or the expectation that the chief sales officer would probably grade themselves on a curve and give them scores that were better or maybe even dramatically better than the rest of the organization. And in fact, the opposite is true. They tend to be the toughest graders. And I think that's probably because they're most in touch with their organization and their sales team. But they don't inflate themselves. And so that's why doing that comparison between and among people is so important. The second thing I like to do is I like to look on a question by question basis, again, across all the different people. If I can get 5 or 6 people in different roles in the organization to complete the assessment, to me, that's a real benefit. And then I start to look at the standard deviation across those scores. That's very telling. One of the most telling one is when it comes to forecasting. Inevitably, there's a wide range of opinion on forecasting, where some people think it's terrific and some people inevitably think it's just horrible and just untimely, and the data is not reliable. Oftentimes, what these surveys point to is not that the data is bad or that the perspective is bad. It's that the communication within the organization just isn't what it needs to be. And so when you go back to these people and you say, boy, why did you score forecasting so off the charts as being bad? You find out that, they don't know where to get the most timely forecast. Ideally, the forecast is at everybody's fingertips. Ideally, the forecast, you go to Salesforce or HubSpot and there's a dashboard and it shows you the most current forecast. But as we all know, many companies, what they do is they take forecasting offline. They take all the data in their CRM system, they dump it into some Google Sheets or Excel spreadsheets, and that becomes the source of truth, which is just wrong. That's just a wrong way to approach forecasting. You want to have one source of truth. You want to make sure that your source of truth is your CRM system, and that way it's updated real time.
Got it. Thanks, Dan. One of the things you highlighted, which I thought was interesting based on some of the initial assessments you've done since Chief Outsiders launched this new sales readiness assessment, is that you found some quick wins. Like one executive could give a low score, but it's purely because they don't know where to get the information. So there's some low-hanging fruit out there.
Absolutely. Anytime you get in these things, you see the low-hanging fruit. Forecasting is one area. The other low-hanging fruit, I have to say, is just looking at the overall usage of the CRM system. As I said earlier, my belief is if it's not in the CRM system, it didn't happen. And so if you start to take that mentality with your sales team and they start saying, well, I had a call with the customer or I changed the forecast. And my response is, hey, if it's not in the CRM, it didn't happen. And so automatically that starts to create the culture that I'm going to go to the CRM system. I'm a data-driven CSO. That's the source of truth. And if your information's not there, it didn't happen. So leading by example in that context is the way to go.
So now we've talked about what goes into sales readiness and some of the initial findings. If there's a small or medium-sized business out there, or a CEO out there, or even a CMO or CRO that wants to understand how ready their sales force is, what does that assessment process look like? What's the time commitment? Aaron, can you guide us through that?
Sure. It's really quite simple. We actually will send you a link for you to share with your team. And as Dan mentioned, it's you want to get it to all the salespeople, the sales leader, and all the management team, and any marketing folks. And send it to, if the company is small, you could send it to the whole organization, because often they're wearing many hats and doing different things. So it takes 5 to 10 minutes to complete. You would fill it out online, and for each area, each P, there are 5 questions, and you just answer them, and that'll come back to us, and then we will compile the results and present it to you, and you can see where the gaps are, and you can begin to make a plan to correct those. Now, there is no charge for this assessment. This is something we offer at Chief Outsiders to our potential clients as a way to see how we approach things, see our methodology, see us in action. And it's a great way to try us out. And frankly, we've won several engagements because of it. And we're really, in these customers are loving it. At the very least, you'll get an idea of some areas to focus on, whether you use us or not.
Got it. Well, thanks, Aaron, for taking us through that. One of the things I noticed is the gap analysis, both in terms of how people answer particular questions, but also relative to the benchmark and comparing to other companies that have taken the assessment. Any insights there, Aaron, on why that benchmarking is important, or why that individual gap analysis is important?
Yeah, it's because of the nature of surveys. People sometimes they'll answer the question based on incomplete information. So it's important, as Dan explained, to go back and query those answers and really understand where the disconnect is. Often, at times, you'll find folks are just not really in tune to what's going on with sales, so they guess. Part of this is an education process to make sure that the whole organization is unified in the sales approach and how it relates to marketing.
Makes sense. Well, Aaron and Dan, I put a link to the assessment in the comments, so anybody who's interested in getting an understanding of their sales readiness and how they can improve their sales performance, take advantage of that, and perhaps Dan or Aaron will be the one who helps you understand that. And some of the other areas that stood out to me in the survey, and perhaps Dan, you could speak to this, and I've seen this firsthand, is just the alignment between the executive team and the sales team when it comes to the financial model and the compensation model. Do you have any recommendations for our audience on how to manage that? Because if the alignment's not there, or if there's conflict there, you're undermining the sales readiness and the sales performance.
Yeah, compensation obviously is critical, especially in B2B businesses with highly motivated salespeople. One of the things we actually absolutely look at is we look at the compensation model when we get in these organizations. We want to make sure two things. First of all, we want to make sure that it's market competitive. And then secondly, we want to make sure that it aligns with the goals and objectives of the organization. Oftentimes I get into these engagements with customers, and the first question I ask is, what percentage of your sales reps made quota last year? And I had a conversation with a customer boy about 4 months ago, and I think the answer was 20%. So 20% of them made their objective. Now, on a 50-50 plan, where 50% of your compensation is coming from base, the reps make it, means that 80% of your sales reps are likely to leave the organization. So compensation isn't just about what people are paid. It's about the lifeblood of your organization, because if they're not being paid, if they're not meeting their numbers, if the compensation plan isn't focused on the right things, your business is in jeopardy. So that's an important consideration.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Well, appreciate you sharing some of the insights and best practices for how small and mid-sized companies can understand their sales readiness and have a more informed decision-making process on how to improve their sales performance and get to a more predictable sales performance. Before we wrap up here, Aaron, do you have any last takeaways? Dan, do you have any last takeaways as it relates to assessing the sales team or sales performance, or one of the 4 Ps?
Yeah, just one quick comment from me before we close this session. One of the things we like to do is obviously we're taking a snapshot at a point in time. The important thing is progression. Are you recognizing those issues? Are you attacking and dealing with those issues? And are you improving? So one of the things that we do is when we do an assessment with you, we save you results. And we would like to come back a year later, whether you work with us or not on engagement, come back a year later, run the same people through the same assessment and see if those gaps are closing. That's very important to us.
Got it. Aaron,
Yeah, I would echo those comments. It's really important to retest and also make the changes and retest and make sure your team's on board. If anything, in the background, what's going on is better communication within the organization. And that was a surprising result out of when we first started doing these to where we're at today, is we're really facilitating the communication of the sales strategy and to make sure it gets executed properly. So again, if you'd like to use us, we've communicated the link to the survey. We'd love to, we welcome the opportunity to help you out.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Dan. And as they both said, there's an opportunity here for you as an SMB or as a CEO or CRO to get an outside perspective, leveraging data and also benchmarking to more effectively communicate that sales strategy and get the organization aligned. And it could be Dan or Aaron who's helping you understand that. So thanks again, Dan and Aaron, and look forward to the next CEO Growth Talks.
You're welcome. Thanks, Angus.
Thanks.